네, 안녕하십니까. Uh, Hello, I'm Minjae Bae, who are planning to give a presentation today. Before I start, I just wanted to, well, first of all, thank you for inviting me. And before the presentation, I would first like to pay my respect and gratitude to the society for the work that the society has, done so far since the early 20th century. The contribution that the early members made, it truly, truly inspired me as a researcher and as a historian. So I will always be in debt to the society, I feel, especially because the transactions are so easy to access online, just opened to the public without even asking to sign in or utilize some kind of program. I mean, on my computer, that doesn't happen normally these days. Uh, I couldn't have I couldn't have complete my PhD thesis without the transactions, and especially the bibliography that Underwood compiled uh, in 1931. That bibliography gave me the entire idea for an original research when I felt, especially personally, when I felt completely lost as a historian. And as a historian, keeping a certain distance from the object of the research is crucial. That was the main reason why I didn't ever try to make connections or reach out to the society before. But at the same time, making an effort to understand the object. In my case, it would the RAS would be one of it, the main part of it, to making an effort to understand the object and keeping, being interested in it is the key, and also a drive for a better research as a researcher. And in that part, the society RAS never ever failed me. So I wanted to express my gratitude towards the society. While preparing for today's presentation, obviously I'm very nervous today, not just because of the language, but I am speaking to the society that I've been writing about in several articles. So it makes me very nervous. However, while preparing for today's presentation, like going back, looking through all the materials that I read before, once more, I was able to gain this new momentum. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I will just start up. Well, the first part is the founding and early activities of the society from 1900 to 1902. The Royal Asiatic Society Korea branch, it started out as this, small academic gathering of Westerners living in Korea during the late 19th to early 20th centuries. It was only after Joseon Dynasty established diplomatic relations with the Western world in the late 19th century that the Western community in Korea was finally formed in the 1880s. So compared to the Western communities formed in China or Japan, the Western community in Korea was relatively small, and it was characterized by its not just its small size, but also the high proportion of Protestant missionaries. Protestant missionaries at the time were generally more active in writing and participated at a relatively high rate in collective writing because they thought that was part of their ministry, that was part of their missionary work. Introducing Korea to the outside world was considered the very important, crucial part of their ministry. And because of the nature of missionary work, having much more connection, having a better understanding of Korea and Korean society and Korean culture itself was important to them. And I think that motivated them to like delve into Korean history and culture at the time. In this context, when it comes to Western literary work about Korea, sometimes it can be difficult to draw a clear distinction between the missionary and academic spheres. However, even among the missionaries, there were like conscious attempts at the time to distinguish between writings undertaken for missionary work, missionary purposes, and writing pursued for academic reasons. Leading these efforts were like individuals such as some famous individuals such as Homo Harbert, James Gale, George Heber Jones, especially Mark Trollope. These individuals came to Korea as missionaries, but later gained renown as authors of works on Korea. And as the 20th century dawned, the earnest movement to establish an intellectual sphere separate from missionary work started. From 1892 to 1898, there was this journal called the Korean Repository, a monthly journal mostly, and that journal mostly had the role of publishing academic papers. There were some other style of papers too, but the Korean Repository held the role of publishing the academic style of writings. But this came to a halt in December the year of 1898. So the Western community began making efforts to establish a Korea branch of the Royal Asiatic Society as a means to continue scholarly activities. There were, though, several restrictions on establishing branches under the Royal Asiatic Society. Like, for example, the financial operations and board composition had to adhere to the headquarters charter, and also activities such as like publishing academic journals could no longer be carried out as missionary work anymore. So those were the restrictions. Well, actually, Brother Anthony wrote a full article about the early history and the people, the individuals who were involved in it, which is like opened in his website. So I tried to keep that part short. This is an image I found on the internet, actually. It's an invitation of the Society's general meetings in the early days. It was sent to Yoon Chi-ho, who was a famous Korean politician in the late 19th and 20th century. He was a very well-connected person. He studied at Vanderbilt and Emory University abroad. He wasn't a member of the society at the time, I think, because I went through the members list and his name wasn't there. Considering the date and the content of the invitation here, it seems like they were inviting him to the third general meeting, perhaps. The third meeting when Hulbert read his paper, which was one of the famous ones, which is Korean Survivals. I included this on the slide to share like the early ambience of the society, because they were sending out these formal invitations to Korean intellectuals at the time, wanted to include them and have an knowledge exchange relationship with the Korean society back in those days. Since its founding, the society has firmly expressed its commitment to strengthening scholarly publications. This commitment is evident in the statement by the society's inaugural president, John Gubbins. He delivered this speech at the first general meeting on 24th October, the year of 1900. And as it says, he's trying to very much emphasize the society's commitment to scholarly work, and he wants to keep the quality, the academic quality of the transactions. That's the whole point. That was the whole point of his speech. In point number one says Gubbins actually emphasized that the Royal Asiatic Society, Korea branch, is a professional and academic society. He also argued that the society should discuss diverse topics concerning Korea in like balanced and dispassionate manner. Additionally, in point two, he says extensive research was like actually mentioned in his speech as a method for professional and academic knowledge activities, as can be seen from the reference to Quran's bibliography, which is bibliography Korean. The emphasis on extensive research actually signifies research based on literary sources in his speech. That's the reason why he's mentioning Maurice Quran's work. Gubbins' introduction to Quran's work was to encourage research activities based on literary sources. So that was the purpose and like how they wanted to run the society from the very beginning. However, producing academic research still does require considerable effort and time, especially to the early members. Most members had no prior experience of specialized training in academic research, and very few had the linguistic proficiency to utilize literary sources, because like the main sources, like Korean literary sources, would be written in obviously classical Chinese characters. So it requires another linguistic level of it. So very few members were able to do that. Consequently, there was a constant shortage of articles because of that reason. It is said that in these early days, the president actually had to encouraged submissions by selecting research topics himself and allocating them to the members. Anyhow, for the first 2 years, general meetings were held very regularly, and the journal was published until December 1902 regularly. However, due to the shortage of manuscripts and various other issues, the society went into hibernation for several years. Although the specific reasons for this suspension, this hibernation of activities were not very clearly identified, 1902 was a year of significant change, and I guess it's just my opinion. It was a year of significant change for its key members. Appenzeller, the missionary Appenzeller, he died in an accident that year. He was drowned, while Mark Trollope, who was another important member, and Jones, obviously, George Herbert Jones, that both two returned to their home countries for professional reasons at the time. And additionally, it appears to have been like mounting problems within the society's leadership. There was frequent conflicts between Hulbert and Allen on various matters. So maybe that might be one of the reasons that the society went into hibernation too. Now, nothing is clearly identified at this point. So I guess these were like it was building up at that point. So the presentation goes to phase 2, which is the academic exchange with the colonial government, the government general of Korea, from year 1911 to 1918. The society's activities resumed in 1911, January. This marks the beginning of the society's second period. Among the newly constituted officers at the time, These are the new elected officers of the society. Only three, like James Gale, William Scranton, and Bunker. Those were the only three members that had participated in the founding in 1900. The reorganization was after the annexation, obviously, and big changes were made, not just because of the annexation, but because of the change in Korea itself. The society, which had previously been a social gathering exclusively, I guess it wasn't a rule, but it was exclusive. It was for Westerners exclusively, Westerners engaged in scholarly pursuits in Korea. It was like that before, but the society then became a space for intellectual exchange between the Japanese government general and the Western community for this phase. Officials of the colonial government actually joined the society as members. Some even joined the council. The volume 4, which was published in 1912 to 13 of Transactions, includes an article actually written by Komatsu Midori. He was the director of the Foreign Affairs Bureau of the Government General. Also, it includes articles written by Yamagata Isaburo, who was the political affairs superintendent at the Government General. Also, Ichihara Morihiro, manager of the Bank of Japan, Japan's Korea branch. He also published an article in volume 4. In the year of 1915, Yamagata Iso, who was the president of the Seoul Press, joined the society as an executive member, and also there was an individual figure called Min Young-chan, a Korean, who was also a counselor of the Central Council of the Government General. He also attended the society's meeting in December the year of 1911, and Min Young-chan would probably be the first only Korean member to join the society at the time. It is said that these big changes appears to have been driven by the influence of the 1911 Korean conspiracy case, which can be called Christian conspiracy case, as well as by the mutual desire of the Japanese government general and the Western community to maintain friendly relations. The Korean conspiracy case is actually, it was a very political incident that happened in the right after the annexation. The government general and the colonial government actually accused some Korean Christian members involved in assassinating the governor general at the time, which didn't actually happen. They were prosecuted as that. However, a bunch of Korean Christians were involved in that because the governor general, the colonial government actually accused the people trying to assassinate the governor general during a meeting that he was having with the missionary, who was Shannon McCune at the time. So the entire Christian community in Korea was kind of involved in that case. So that might be the reason why the Western community and also the society wanted to maintain somewhat friendly relationship with the governor general, with the colonial government too. Because both sides were on good terms for a while, for several years, the society actually got access to the resources for scholarly work on Korea, because the colonial government were the main institution that had the authority to compile or publish knowledge material or resources at the time. The colonial government had exclusive possession of various survey materials and statistics and all of the statistics that had been collected since the protectorate era. So from the early to mid 1910s, the colonial authorities and the society had set up this academic exchange relationship, which included sharing researches. There are several examples of it on Transactions 2. The 1916 Transactions, Volume 7, contains a paper on Korean gold mines, which reveals which is written by Edwin Mills. And the author of this paper actually received data and assistance from the Ministry of Agriculture at the time. Not just Ministry of Agriculture, but also Ministry of Commerce and Industry was also involved in this research. Mills also was working at the Unsan gold mine as an employer, as an official at the time. By obtaining mining-related statistics, he was able to compile this work on gold mines located all over the Korean Peninsula. His paper on Korea's gold mines was later included in the publication that is called Settlements in Korea, which was published by the colonial government in 1933. The article called Afforestation in Korea, which is written by missionary Edwin Wade Coons, was published in Transactions Volume 6 in 1915. And it was a report submitted to not just published in Transactions, but it was also submitted to the Forestry Department of the Government General at the time. Between and also around that time, Ralph G. Mills, who was a faculty at Severance Medical School, he conducted a survey on the Dongne River ecosystem, collecting nearly 400 species, some of which were really new to the academic circles at the time. And these specimens were sent to the Kew Botanical Gardens in England and also to the Imperial University of Tokyo for study. And research on these specimens were subsequently published in British and Japanese academic journals too. So the members at the time were actively interacting, exchanging these research results with the government general in a very friendly and cooperated way. However, this relationship gradually, I think it dissolved around the late 1910s. According to the Sai's report, there was this figure who is mentioned in the report, which is Hishida Seiji. He was an interpreter in the Foreign Affairs Department of the Government General, and he was also a council member of the society since 1915, but he had to return to Japan in 1918. Hishida, he studied at both New York University and Columbia University, and had been working as an interpreter since 1907. So he was in Korea, he was working here in Korea before the annexation, meaning he had personal relationship with the society members for quite a long time. After Hishida returned to Japan, Imamura Juzo succeeded him as an interpreter in the Foreign Affairs Department. However, there's no record whatsoever of Imamura Juzo joining the society or attending its meetings, anything. This indicates that the link between the society and the colonial government provided through human overlap was gradually shrinking at that time, because the interpreter at the government general, especially a member of the Foreign Affairs Department, usually had personal connections with the society members on regular basis. But that relationship, I think, kind of dissolved after Hishida went back to Japan. Meanwhile, the society didn't just depend on resources shared by the colonial government. The society was independently devising ways to collect and utilize academic resources and also literary materials. From the late 1910s to early 20s, Western literary work on Korea, such as Hamill's Journal, The Shipwreck of Yatsboro, which is the English translated title, and also Basil Hall's Voyage Accounts. Those kind of records were translated and introduced in the transactions. The society also initiated its own like long-term research projects on like Korea's trees, climate, and ecology. The minutes of the society meetings held in February, the year of 1916, it states that Ralph Mills of the Severance Medical School, he started researching Korean acupuncture and lung fluke. And at that time, the school, the Severance Medical School, actually established a research department led by Ralph Mills, James Van Buskirk, and Alfred Ludlow, who are all members of the society. Mills's research was connected to the activities of this research department at Severance Medical School, and also Van Buskirk's, his study of the climate in Korea, which is published in volume 10 of the Transactions in 1919. It was also a paper from the research department of the Severance Medical School. In that research, interestingly, Van Buskirk used like this Western science to study the relationship between climate and the civilization in Korea. So I do recommend that paper. It is pretty interesting. In the early 1920s, efforts were also made to establish a society library. The library to support members' scholarly activities. Obviously, the library was largely established thanks to the determination of Mark Trollope, who was an Anglican missionary from England. And he was the president at the time. Earlier, before the society was even founded, in 1898, April, Trollope actually purchased the entire collection of books left behind another Anglican medical missionary who was Eli B. Landis after his death. This established the Landis Memorial Library at the Chemulpo mission station somehow, because he was working there, because Eli Landis was working at Chemulpo before he died. But when RAS was founded, when the society was founded, the charters actually from England, the British charters actually required a library to actually form a society. That was one of the deals. So Trollope actually lent the Landis book collection to the society in accordance with the British headquarters regulations, which, as I said, required a library. So ever since Trollope became president in 1918, the society actively pursued the buying books, collecting more books, and also encouraged members to make use of the library as much as they can and make use of the library collection. The library collection list was regularly included in the transactions at that time. And whenever there was a large scale of significant purchase of books, it was also featured in the transactions at the time. The necessary funds for purchasing books were secured by reducing the commission paid to the journal's distributor. It was written in the society meeting record. The support of academic activities in the 1920s during Mark Trollope's reign as president later actually formed the basis for the compilation of Underwood's bibliography. So this is the third part of the presentation, the compilation of the bibliography, the background and scholarly significance of Underwood's bibliography would be the third part. The whole title is quite long. It's called A Partial Bibliography of Occidental Literature on Korea from Early Times to 1930. And it's compiled by Horace H. Underwood. And it was published in the Transactions, Vol.20 in 1931. It was not just Underwood's own project. It was a society-wide project initiated during Trollope's term as president. Although it's not clear when the plan to compile this bibliography was made, it appears that the work began in the late 1920s after Underwood returned to Korea from the States after his PhD, after he received his, was it a PhD or was it a master's? I think it was a PhD, right? So after he received his PhD, he returned to Korea in the late 1920s. And after he returned and became a council member of the society, Mark Trollope actually made this proposition to, how about compiling this entire bibliography of Western literature on Korea? And that was the very beginning. And according to the preface published in the same volume, the entire process took approximately 2 years. And in the preface, the compiler, Underwood, states that he actually states the purpose of compiling the entire bibliography, and it was, he's highlighting, he's actually saying in this, through this entire preface, he's he's emphasizing this bibliography is compiled to highlight areas of research that require further investigation by presenting an overview of Western literature on Korea. Therefore, introducing a disciplinary classification system was crucial. That's the reason why he spends a bunch of, the proportion of the preface explaining about the classification system. Underwood actually used various reference materials to design the classification system, not just to collect the actual literature, but to actually design his own classification system. The references are also included at the end of the bibliography. I was so thankful that he, left the reference. Anyway, among them, Oscar Nahad's Bibliography of the Japanese Empire from 1906 to 1926, which was published in 1928, is particularly noteworthy among all the references. This bibliography was a continuation of an earlier bibliography compiled by, how do I say his name? Frederick von Wengstern. And it classifies literature in European languages about Japan, published between those years. Underwood actually, in the bibliography at the end, he actually praised this work, Nahad's work, as the most complete bibliography. But he also pointed out that it was not a bibliography containing all articles about Korea. That's the point he wanted to make. Underwood aimed to distinguish his work from Nahad's bibliography in 2 key ways. First, he aimed to supplement the Western literary works on Korea omitted from Nahad's bibliography. Second, rather than treating Korea as a subcategory within the classification system, Underwood sought to establish a distinct classification system. Since Nahad's bibliography covered only publications issued from 1906 to 26, it naturally excluded articles from like the Korean Repository, the Korean Review, those journals, because those journals were published before 1906. Furthermore, a significant portion of articles published in for example, in the Korean mission field, the Korea magazine, were also not included in Nahad's bibliography, despite being published within the designated period. And these periodicals, as I mentioned, like the Korean Repository, the Korea Magazine, Korea Mission Field, these periodicals, these journals constituted an important element, not only within the Western community in Korea, but also in the literary works on Korea from the late 19th to early 20th centuries. So Underwood thought that a very important part is missed out in Nahad's bibliography. The classification system is the second thing that Underwood wanted to distinct his work from. The classification system of Nahad's bibliography was also kind of problematic in that it treated Western literature on Korea as a subcategory of that concerning Japan. From the perspective of an academic society conducting scholarly research on Korea, in this case, it would be RAS, the society, right? This classification system, Nahad's classification system, was difficult to accept, not just for Underwood, but for the society. The most comprehensive category in Nahad's bibliography was obviously the Japanese Empire, because the entire bibliography says it's about the Japanese Empire. And since Korea was a subcategory under it, the classification system remained, in Nahad's bibliography, it remained quite, oh, here it is. I made this table to see. In Nahad's bibliography, the classification system for Korea, it was, how do I point this? It remained incomplete, intermingled within publications about Japan. For example, Korean-related journals such as the Korean Review or also Transactions were listed not under the Korea entry over here, but it was actually listed under the periodicals over here. It was mixed with other journals about Japan. The classification and arrangement actually on bibliography, it indicates that the literary works on Korea were primarily considered as subordinate knowledge under the Japanese Empire. That's the reason why Underwood wanted to make his classification system very different from Nahad's work. Well, until the 20th century, literary works on Korea in Western bibliographies, not just in Nahad's bibliography. In Western bibliographies, literary works on Korea were classified as subcategory of China, actually. It used to be like that until the late 19th century. After that, they become a subcategory of knowledge about Japan. And these classification systems represented the Western framework for conceptualizing East Asia, and it was used to, understand and explain the entire region. So it's not just a classification for books, it indicates how the Western, understands the entire East Asia. Prior to the 19th century, European intellectuals generally encountered information and knowledge about Korea through writings on China and Japan. And based on this fact, in bibliographies, most of the writings were also classified as knowledge about China or Japan before the 19th century. Even though some writings, they contained some information and knowledge about Korea, it used to be classified under knowledge about China or Japan in Western bibliographies. The fact that Underwood's bibliography constituted a self-contained classification system signifies that Korea was considered a separate subject and field of scholarly research distinct from China and Japan. So that moment, when the bibliography was published, he was actually, the society was actually claiming, making a point that Korea, literary work on Korea is not knowledge about China and Japan anymore. So they were making a statement about it. Another characteristic of the classification system in Underwood's bibliography is that while it does follows the basic structure of the classification of disciplinary knowledge, so it doesn't look, if you see the classification system, it doesn't look particularly unnormal. It looks almost like a normal classification system in other bibliographies too. So he does follow the basic structure of disciplinary knowledge, such as language, literature, history, religion, art. Those are all the normal entries that are included in other bibliographies classification system. But Underwood's bibliography also partially reflects the characteristics of the collected literary works on Korea. The classification systems of Nahad's and Underwood's bibliography, you can see in the table over here, entries such as like early works on 1880, or early works to 1880. Those like the entry A over there, those things are not usually shown in other normal bibliographies, right? And also missions. In other bibliographies, normally it's also the missionary work is normally included in like entries like religion, but they took that part, but Underwood actually took that part out. Fiction and poetry on Korea is somehow also a very unique entry. And these three entries strongly reflected the particularities of Western community in Korea, to which the compiler, Underwood himself, also belonged. Entry A, early works to 1880s, was for Western language literature on Korea produced before the formation of Western community in Korea. So that's why he wanted to draw a line. He wanted to make some kind of chronological line in his bibliography. The works from 1880s and works before the 1880s, because the 1880s was the time when the Western community was formed in Korea. And entry B, mission, was created to distinguish literature in the field of missions, in which the compiler and many other Westerners in Korea were involved. So they wanted to take that part out from the religion entry. Furthermore, there are 32 to 35 poems and novels included in the entry C over here, fiction and poetry on Korea. And it was also, and in this entry, the literary work included in this entry were also mostly written by Westerners in Korea at the time. So Underwood's classification system reflects the compiler's intention to position the writings on Western community in Korea at the center. That was also, I think, one of his intentions of this classification system. This was based on the idea that the Western community in Korea played a pivotal role in establishing the distinct knowledge domain of Korea, separate from China and Japan, by producing knowledge about Korea over approximately 50 years from 1880s onward. The compilation of Underwood's bibliography aimed to improve, as I mentioned before, improve access to Western literature on Korea as a source of knowledge. So particularly the research achievements for Westerners living in Korea. So following its publication, there were certain changes within the society, especially the work that the society published. So following the bibliography's publication, scholarly works focusing on the introduction and utilization of Western literature on Korea were steadily presented within the society too. For example, a Korean member, an early Korean member who is called Oh Moon-hwan. He published an article in 1933 on the missionary Robert Jermaine Thomas, published in the Transactions, volume 22. And his article included the missionary's reports and letters. Actually, another member, Professor Bae Minjae's article in 1935 in Transactions, volume 24, this article excerpt and translated records from the annals of the Joseon dynasty concerning Basil Hall's visit to Korea in the early 19th century. So before this article, the only accessible records on Basil Hall's voyage was Basil Hall's own account. But Professor Bae Minjae actually he found out what the annals of Joseon dynasty in the records, how they perceived Basil Hall's visit. So that way, if anyone is interested about research of Basil Hall's voyage, they can have both sides of records. So that was his way to contributing in academic activities. And also,
do you think there's an influence of path which these missionaries came to Korea, whether they came directly to Korea versus they came through China just by the familiarity of what they're used to, through the lens through which they see Korea? Do you see a different pattern? Yes.
Well,
There's very
for the early missionaries, there might be a little bit of influence because the early missionaries, most of the early missionaries, I think they came to Korea through Japan mostly. Some from China, but mostly through Japan because that was the route of the ships at the time. But, well, in the case of Henry Appenzeller, he stayed in Japan for quite a while, I think, also Underwood too, because at the time they were trying to come into Korea, there was this huge political incident, so they couldn't actually get into the country at the time. So they had to, stay in Japan for like more than a month or two. So I do think that might influenced it, but most of the part is because the records they had access to at the time, especially in the late 19th century to early 20th century, were actually records that were written by China or Japan or written from Westerners that resided in China or Japan. So that was a huge part of influence when it comes to their perception at the very beginning. But well, the government general, I guess, they did have a very significant role when it comes to knowledge resources because the colonial government was, the institution that had the authority to compile all the knowledge resources. And actually, Professor Bae Minjae's article over here about the Joseon dynasty, annals of the Joseon dynasty, that wasn't even accessible until the colonial government actually published it. It was compiled during the Joseon dynasty, but it wasn't accessible for people for research before the colonial government. So after the colonial government published it for people to actually get access to it, that's when the not just the Western community in Korea, but also the intellectuals in Korea also had access to their own records. So there were very, short amount of records that were written by the Koreans at the time that Westerners had access to. So I do think that was the huge part of influence. Additionally, Transactions Volume 22 that was published in 1937 included Bishop Mutel's diary and commentary. So during the 1930s, they were trying to, compile and publish their own knowledge material, I guess, by, I would say, investigating old records, not just written in old classical Chinese characters, but they realized that the old records written by early Westerners in Korea could also be, knowledge material and resources that they can actually utilize in their own researches. So that was the main difference and the main change that the publication of Underwood's bibliography actually did to the society. This demonstrates that the compilation of Underwood's bibliography was not merely an individual's labor's endeavor, but rather a project initiated by the society. Its purpose was to establish a distinctively Korean domain of knowledge, separate from China and Japan, and to expand the use of knowledge produced and accumulated within the Western community in Korea. So through this bibliography that Underwood compiled, the Western community and the literary work that they have done for the last 50 years was actually promoted by this bibliography too. That's the reason why they made all these distinctive entries that mainly carries the literary works by the Western communities. The Royal Asiatic Society Korea branch is, as I mentioned before, is smaller in scale than compared to Chinese and Japanese branches. It is characterized by the fact that most of its members lived in Korea for long periods as missionaries or diplomats. Missionaries in particular often settle down in Korea, raising families, in some cases for 2 or 3 generations. These characteristics also served as the driving force behind their long-term research activities. However, at that time, the scholarly community the society had not yet established like this professional academic networks with like universities or research institutes abroad. Furthermore, until the early to mid 20th century, Korean studies was not a distinct academic field separate from China or Japan in the United States either within European Oriental Studies nor within American Regional Studies. However, the second generation of Westerners in Korea, such as like George McQueen, Shannon McQueen, who had extensive experience of Korean language and society because they were born here and raised here for a certain amount of time, they endeavored to establish a connection between the society's research achievements and Korean studies in the United States especially after the Second World War. So that's why George McCune, he actually died right after the Second World War, so he didn't have that much amount of time. However, Shannon McCune, he tried to revise the Underwood bibliography by himself in the 50s and 60s. So those were the things that they were like trying to make connection because the society was at that point labeled as amateurs, and I don't think that's actually fair. However, he was trying to, like the second generation of Westerners were trying to make the connection, establish a connection between the research before the Second World War to Korean studies, to the field of Korean studies after the Second World War. Therefore, as Korean studies has been established as a subfield of regional studies at the time, the influence of pre-war literary works on Korea must also be continuously analyzed and considered. So that's the part that recently I was focusing on. So yes, I think that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Well, thank you for your presentation. At the beginning, you differentiated writings about Korea compared to writings about Japan and writings about China. If I remember correctly, you said that a lot more writing about Korea that came from religious missionaries compared to China.
Yes, yes.
And I wonder if that's because, although the times don't match up, if you go back enough to, I don't know, 15th, 16th century, when Europeans were first going to China and Japan,
Yes,
they were
yes.
mainly Jesuits. We
Yeah,
had
of
kind of a
course.
similar
Yeah.
case there, where most of the Western
Mhm.
knowledge production about China
Of course. Mhm.
at that time was also from
Mhm.
missionaries, although they weren't Protestant, they were Catholic missionaries.
Mhm.
I think it's a similar, maybe a similar phenomenon you're seeing in all three countries, just that the times don't match up. So that Korea, because it remained closed longer, it happened later.
Of course.
Same phenomenon. But
Well, it can be seen as very similar, and in a lot of ways, it is quite similar because, as you said, sir, Korea was closed for a long time. During the 16th to 17th century, the Catholic missionaries they did at some point try to, expand their missionary work to Korea at a certain point, but the Chinese emperor at the time did not prefer that because the diplomatic relationship that Joseon dynasty had was always, I wouldn't say controlled, but that was the East Asian rule back at the time because the Chinese Empire was the suzerain, and that was the style of relationship that Joseon dynasty had with the Chinese Empire. So the Joseon dynasty were not actually allowed to have diplomatic relations or exchanges with other countries without the Chinese Empire's consent. So that was the main reason why back in the 15th to 18th century, there are not many direct records about Korea by Westerners. In this case, after the late 19th century, obviously Korea was also, late to, build a diplomatic relationship with the Western countries too. However, this time, even though the Joseon dynasty was still not very much open to having a relationship with the Western world, this time in the late 19th century, it was actually the Chinese Empire who suggested having a diplomatic relationship with, especially the United States and England, because they were trying to, I don't know, prevent Japan having all the influence over Korea. So that was, another diplomatic game that China was playing at the time. But when it comes to the Western community in Korea, the high proportion of missionaries is because Korea was not a larger or huger market, I think. In the case of China and Japan, there are, various figures, various jobs in the Western community too. However, in the case of Japan, actually the government hired a lot of Western engineers in the late 19th century. So that formed a very unique Western community. And when it comes to diplomats, all the main, well, how do I say this? The major, spots for diplomats were obviously China and Japan, not Korea. Korea was a very secondary post when it comes to diplomats at the time. So once you become a diplomat to Korea, a counselor or something, if you do well or things change, you get promoted and moved to obviously China or Japan at the time. So they weren't it was hard to have regular long-term members except missionaries. But Protestant missionary work was very successful. And I'm not even sure why, but well, there are a lot of researches about that in Korean history too. But first of all, the Joseon government even though the Joseon government had made a lot of mistakes, they did made a very smart move when it comes to Protestant missionary work. They asked the Protestant missionaries to only medical missionary work and modern education. Those were the two conditions that the government actually made when it comes to Protestant missionary work. And Because, modern medicine, it's very hard to build up from scratch. It takes a lot of money, work, and effort. So yeah, became very popular in Korea among Korean society. Modern education, Korean people were always eager to receive education, even back in those days. That's the reason why tourist missionary work was so successful compared to China and Japan. So even though it was, similar, it looks similar compared to the 15th to 18th century, 19th to 20th century, the timing, yes, similar, but the context might be pretty different. Mhm.
Question is, thanks for your lecture.
Mhm.
My question is, I'm thinking about the visa. You know the James Herbert,
Mhm.
the historical traveler, when he when he comes to Korea, 1891 to 93.
Uh-huh.
He listed the visa.
Uh-huh.
Photo.
Yes,
But I
yes.
never see the visa from like missionaries or any diplomats.
Uh-huh.
How at the time the Joseon government
Uh-huh.
they handled the visa for those people who came to Korea, also missionaries or what?
I think that was discussed when they were, having in the treaties. I think that was discussed in the treaties in one of the conditions. However, the British government at the time was making a huge deal about having the visa for, traveling, not just in the ports, but traveling inland. That was the huge deal between the British government and Joseon government. I do remember seeing that on articles and documents, but visas, I think nobody ever, actually was curious about the visas. They were just, after, the treaty was passed, they were just allowed to come into Korea and travel inland. There was no restriction after the treaty. Before the treaty, they were all, the Catholic missionaries were like smugglers, so they were very illegal immigrations. A lot of them got executed, but after the treaty in 1883 and 1882, there was no restrictions for foreigners since then. America concluded a treaty with Korea in 1882. The British government concluded a treaty in 1883 November. I remember it to be November because they were waiting for the treaty between the Chinese Empire and Korea, a new treaty, because that guaranteed that the foreigners who visit Korea gained full access of inland traveling. So I do remember that part.
But
Uh-huh.
the guy James Herbert Paris
Uh-huh.
from Korea,
Uh-huh.
he received the Korean visa from Korean government.
Of course, I do think that there was some kind of form of that.
Says it can go like Gangwon-do or Kumgangsan, whatever they mentioned those areas. So I was curious about the other people, how he came to this.
Well, that's very curious because there was a geologist from Germany who visited Korea, and right after the treaty was concluded, he was able to travel everywhere. He also, made this huge article and published it in 1885 and 6 in Germany, and he had no restrictions on traveling all around. So I do want to see that visa. Wow, it's very interesting.
Just 1 second.
Oh, I'm very curious that there was a visa. Uh-huh.
Yeah, this is the visa.
Oh,
So he can go. Oh, so he can
let
go
me see.
Gangwon-do and
강원도,
they call Hojo at that time.
상해, 평안. It's all over the country.
Yeah, but
Like,
and they give us time too. I think time.
oh yeah, I think it's just something like a 외국인 등록증이랑 비슷한
Right, but
그런.
I want to
Uh-huh.
know how about the missionaries? I never see any missionary or
Uh-huh.
diplomats how they have any visa.
No one ever mentioned it before. I might look up to it. Yeah, no one have mentioned it before. Any other questions? Thank you.
I have a slightly different question.
Mhm.
In the beginning, it was mainly missionaries and little bit of diplomats.
Yes. Mhm. Mhm.
During.
One or two businessmen, I guess.
There's,
Uh-huh.
during the sixties, we begin to have a major influx of Peace Corps volunteers.
Yes.
And still a little bit of diplomats.
Mhm.
There are few masters who served as the president.
Mhm.
Now, a lot of those missionaries are obviously gone. The Peace Corps volunteers are also phasing out very quickly. We have
I guess so, yeah.
So the next wave, whatever it might be,
Mhm.
where do you see us going? How is it affecting the nature of our society? I'd like to see a different perspective from the outside who study this.
Well,
We are dealing with a bit of an identity
Oh.
change.
well, I don't have, to be honest, I don't have a lot of insight when it comes to these matters, but however, because I'm teaching college students and I teach a regular course in Catholic University. The course is mainly, the students are mainly from Europe and they choose to, come to Korea as an exchange student or any other kind of form. And the big difference is that they're like, it used to be like, oh, I first applied to Japan, but I couldn't make it. So my second choice, Korea, that was, the pattern. But these days, it's not like that. They are mainly interested in Korea and Korean culture. And there are a lot of, European students in, for example, in Berlin, the Free University of Berlin. Their Korean Studies department is huge these days. And I do think that, the younger generation might be the new field because they are genuinely interested, not just interested in K-pop and modern culture, but the students who major in Korean studies would be like the new field because those students are pretty active these days.
Last question, anyone else?
Thank you for listening.